Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Europe Elects podcast with me, Gabriel Hedengren, and my friend and colleague, Javid Ibad. Hi, Javid.
Hi, Gabriel. How have you been?
I've been very good, thank you. I've down with a bit of a cold, so I apologize to everyone for being a bit sniffly, but otherwise, well, the spring is here and we've got a crazy, intense election period coming up for the coming couple of months. So for us politics nerds, it's a good time. Focusing on Europe more than other parts of the world is my road to sanity, I think, these weeks.
I'm doing fantastic.
Just for context for everyone, we're recording this on Sunday, the 22nd of March. We have an election happening today in Slovenia, and we've got elections happening in sort of rapid succession over the next month or so, with Denmark next week. So do keep that in mind that we still don't know the results for Slovenia or Denmark, but we'll still talk to you about the dynamics of the campaigns, the different parties, why the elections were timed the way they were, etc., etc. And then in our next episode in April, we'll have, I think, 4 national election results to discuss between us. So looking forward to that as a follow-up. Do you want to kick off by talking about the election in Slovenia, Javid?
Yes, as we're talking here right now, in a small Central European nation of Slovenia, people are going to elect their new government. Currently, the current government is led by Robert Golob from the centrist Svoboda Freedom Party. The government is a center-left coalition of the Freedom Movement, Social Democrats and the left. On March 22nd, today, they're going to the polls for the nationwide parliamentary elections amidst a series of prominent cabinet reshuffling moves, scandals and repeated periods of low approval for the current government under Robert Golob. Golob led the Liberal Freedom Movement into power in 2022 in an election that was considered a landslide victory, with 41 seats, just 5 seats shy of an absolute majority in the 90-seat Slovenian National Assembly. Numerous pre-election cooperation agreements were made and broken in the run-up to the election, including a failed attempt by Svoboda to consolidate center-left parties into a single alliance. Significant crises have plagued the government since its formation, including policy disagreements which led to the resignation of numerous cabinet ministers. Most recently, the Justice Minister and the Interior Minister resigned in October 2025 following an outcry in the aftermath of the death Aleš Šutar by a group of Romani individuals. In response, Golob passed a security measure which has been criticized by international law experts abroad for targeting those in the Roma community. Polling: 88 out of 90 seats are elected via an open proportional representation list in 8 constituencies. 2 seats are reserved for ethnic minorities. If I'm not mistaken, 1 seat for the Hungarian minority and the other for the Italian. SDS, which is the mainstream right party, currently leads in the polling, with the latest polls showing support between 25 and 28%. Svoboda movement is in second, with the latest polling having a fluctuate between 20 and 22%. Social Democrats are around at 10%, which would be an overperformance compared to the 2022. And the left plus Vesna, which is the Green Alliance, would get around 8%. A coalition is likely, although hypothetical compositions have not been a main theme in the campaign cycle or manifestos. And as a final note, just to mention that SDS, even though it is a member of the EPP and it may be considered as a mainstream right party, in practice it's a party that is quite radicalized over the last years and can pretty much be considered as a radical right party, with its leader Janez Janša being described as the Slovenian Viktor Orban.
Let's see what happens today. As you said, there will be some kind of coalition agreement regardless. But yeah, it'll be interesting to see how it goes. Obviously, the last election was this sort of very surprising, sort of rupturous one. So I guess this will be the first test in this new electoral landscape in Slovenia to see how it falls out. The other election that's happening in March is in Denmark. As I'm sure a lot of you know, the current government is led by Prime Minister Mette Frederiksen of the Social Democratic Party. She is in a coalition with a group of centre to centre-right parties. So it's the Social Democrats, Venstre, Denmark's Liberal Party, and historically the large party to the centre-right, although it's much reduced in size now, as well as the Moderates, which is a relatively new party formed by Anders Løkke Rasmussen, former Prime Minister of Denmark, who broke out of Venstre to form this slightly more centrist movement. He's been relatively high profile this year as the Foreign Secretary of Denmark. So the Danes will go to the polls on the 24th of March during a very contentious time for Denmark as it faces these international decisions ranging from the American aspirations for Greenland, as well as obviously the geopolitical situation we're in at the moment with the war in the Middle East. Several wars, almost. The previous election in Denmark was held on 31st of October 2022, and that saw the Social Democrats emerge with a plurality of 50 seats out of the 179 total in the Danish parliament, which is called the Folketing. The Liberal Venstre, Denmark's Liberal Party, lost 20 seats in that election, while, as I mentioned, the moderates entered the parliament for the first time with 16 seats. This led to this pretty unique sort of cross-block coalition in Danish politics. Mette Frederiksen has been prime minister before with a more left-leaning coalition at that time, but the sort of outcome of how the vote spread in 2022 led her to make the decision to instead tilt right to continue to keep hold of government in the position as prime minister. The timing of these elections were a surprise. So in Denmark, they have a system, like in a lot of countries, where there's not a set date for elections. It's up to the prime minister to call them, as long as it's within 4 years of the previous one. So again, she had between now and October to call an election, and she did it earlier this year, although it's quite obvious that it was a strategic call because at the time, especially January, February time, the Social Democrats and the other parties in the coalition had received what you might call a Greenland bounce in the polls after Trump's rhetoric and all the international politics surrounded Greenland and the support for Denmark, and I guess the public sort of support for the way it was handled by the government. That was seen as a good time to try and seize that sort of increased sense of public support, even though they're still pretty unpopular. Prior to November 2025, which was when sort of the more intensified conversations around Greenland started, the Social Democrats suffered a major defeat across Denmark in the local elections held at the time, including losing Copenhagen to other parties further to the left, for example, which was a historic stronghold. So it was sort of seen as a bit of momentum was reached. Now's the time to try and maximize the results in the next parliament. It's still pretty unclear. So in terms of blocks, when you look at Danish polling aggregates and things like that, you still sort of see 4 different blocks usually. So it's like the current government or the opposition, and then the traditional left and the traditional right. Although it's sort of more framed as in the current campaign, around the different individuals that are hypothetical prime ministerial candidates for the blocks and what might they want to do. Obviously, if the Social Democrats get plurality, Mette Frederiksen will most likely get a chance again to form a government. The left-wing unity list and the Red Greens are obviously pushing, in that case, for a red bloc coalition, if it's possible, with themselves and the Green Left. And this is sort of seen as a realistic scenario because in the European elections in 2024, the Green Left won a plurality of the votes in that election, and they do have strong momentum, especially in the urban core of Copenhagen in Denmark. Although it is very unlikely that the Social Democrats will be happy with this kind of pure left setup if they win the most seats, although it remains to be seen. The current defence minister, Troels Lund Poulsen, who is from the Liberal Party Venstre, has proposed a blue bloc with himself as the PM in coalition with the centre-right Conservative People's Party and the radical Danish People's Party, who have endorsed this. It's interesting also to say that the Danish People's Party, who's obviously one of the sort of OGs of sort of far-right populist parties gaining success and legitimacy in Europe, they were sort of almost eradicated a few years ago in Danish politics with lots of competition on the radical right and sort of a shifting policy debate in the country. They've had an upswing in the last year or so, so they're also now a player in this sort of game for what coalition that there will be. The sort of more libertarian Liberal Alliance have also proposed a different kind of blue bloc, also including the moderates who are in the current coalition government as well, to try and have a core of that bloc be more liberal rather than right-wing. So it's this interesting scenario where the different parties in the coalition are proposing different things, and in the end we might see something kind of similar to what we have now with maybe 1 or 2 parties joining from either side. We will see. In terms of polling, as I said, the Social Democrats have steadily gained in the polls since November last year, although it's a fragmented landscape in Denmark at the moment, with, according to Europe Elect's polling aggregate in mid-March, they had just 21%, which is a massive loss on the 2022 elections, followed in second place by the Red Greens at 13%, and then you go down from there. The moderates in particular, led by Lars Løkke Rasmussen, as I mentioned, had their first election last time, and they've really struggled a lot since then with this new government arrangement. They had a bit of a Greenland bounce, but are still just around sort of 5% in the polls, so that they're definitely weakened. If you look at the aggregates by bloc, the polling is pretty close. Pretty realistic that there will be a red bloc majority versus the blue, but it remains to be seen. That sums it up, Javid. It's interesting when a country gets into that situation where it becomes fragmented and parties are crossing the blocks, because it becomes very hard to sort of see what the outcome will be. Like Finland is a bit similar, so it could really go in any sort of directions, and then obviously there'll be negotiations once the results are in.
The Nordic politics are actually becoming increasingly more interesting, especially we have the Swedish elections in fall, in September, October this year. But also you see how the debate around migration is getting even stricter and stricter in Denmark, and it's actually becoming a bit out of control at this point.
What's been interesting is that because the Social Democrats have sort of tried to neutralize it and is part of that bloc that is very firm or harsh on migration, it's also sort of pushed it down the importance of what people vote on for a lot of voters. So yeah, it is definitely a new kind of landscape though across the Nordics, and it's slowly becoming, I think, more clearly different from a lot of the quote-unquote continental politics like in France and Germany. So yeah.
So we're probably going to one of the biggest electoral thrillers of this calendar year, which is going to happen in Hungary on April the 12th, 2026. Hungarians will go to the polls to decide whether to re-elect Viktor Orban for a fifth term. The Hungarian opposition is led by Péter Magyar, who joined the minor party TISA in 2024. Magyar was initially a member of Fidesz, however he resigned from the party after a scandal concerning the presidential pardon given to an official who helped cover up child sex abuse. TISA was founded in 2020, but it failed to contest the 2022 parliamentary election. TISA, before Magyar, was a conservative party that claimed to lack an ideology. However, now party has become the vehicle for Magyar and his beliefs. Magyar chose to join TISA because of its ideological vagueness, enabling him to run a catch-all strategy where it tries to appeal as many Hungarians as possible. TISA has run on a relatively pro-EU anti-corruption platform, though the party accepts Fidesz views about migration and stays silent about culture war issues. In the 3 months after Magyar joined the party, TISA was able to unite the opposition and come a strong second in 2024 European elections. The party has now set up TISA Islands to mobilize supporters in rural areas and has placed a lot of effort into recruiting popular local candidates. This is necessary given Hungary's electoral system, which favors rural voters, because Fidesz officials redrew the electoral map in 2014 in their favor. They were able to do so by varying the sizes of each district, spreading their voters across smaller districts while packing opposition voters in largely populated districts. TISA members were able to choose their candidates in local two-round primaries. Fidesz's campaign has focused on caricaturing TISA as an agent of the European Union and Ukraine. Orban has used the closure of Druzhba pipeline in Ukraine as a campaign issue. The pipeline has been closed after a Russian attack. Ukraine claims it doesn't want to run. Hungary is accusing Ukraine of not repairing of the pipeline quickly enough and is blocking a 90 billion euro loan to Ukraine as a result, allowing Orban to claim he's fighting for the interests of the Hungarian people versus TISA, who represents Brussels. There is also a potential release of a sex tape of Péter Magyar. A website was posted with an image of a bedroom. Magyar admitted to having consensual sex with his ex-girlfriend in that room and attacked the Hungarian authorities for filming them. No tape has currently been released, but it is possible that the Hungarian authorities decide to release the tape, maybe before the elections. Who knows?
Looks to be very tight and thrilling, and obviously, given Hungary's role geopolitically, it's one of the elections that will have the most ramifications internationally as well in terms of the political tilt of Europe. It feels like we've had way too long without a Bulgarian election, so We used to have them every other month, it felt like, but we now have the Bulgarians again. Brave Bulgarians are going to the polls on April the 19th for national parliamentary elections. It's a pretty pessimistic electorate. 42% of Bulgarians expect that the elections will result in an unstable government yet again. As I alluded to, in recent history, Bulgaria has had tumultuous series of governments, leading to instability in many elections, as well as large-scale protests and demonstrations in response to various scandals and widespread corruption and that kind of thing. Just to paint a picture, it's been 7 elections in 4 years. Pretty crazy. Protests over the last few months have been due to issues of corruptions and economic concerns among the electorate, spearheaded by mainly young professionals in urban areas, and it began due to proposals to increase taxes in the private sector. Over time, this wave of protests has grown, leading to increased pressure on the government and parliament. The previous government, held by Rosen Shelyashkov from GERB, who was part of the European People's Party, resigned back in December. He claiming that he'd heard the voice of the people who have been protesting. We need to meet their demands, and what they're demanding at the moment is the resignation of the government. Rumours then emerged that the Bulgarian president, Rumen Radev, who's not affiliated to a specific party but historically centre-left, was going to form a new party after the last government's collapse. This proved true. In January earlier this year, he formed and has since then led the ideologically centre-left Progressive Bulgaria Party, PB. As a result of this, he resigned as president to lead Progressive Bulgaria into the election later this month. He has opposed Russian sanctions, and his party has been described as marginally pro-Russian among political analysts, although this description is up to debate internally. But it's, I guess, one of those parties that you see across a lot of Eastern and Central Europe, where it's centre-left or left-wing on politics, has working-class base and background, but on social issues and geopolitical issues diverge pretty significantly from the sort of centre-left S&D parties in Northern and Western Europe. Progressive Bulgaria has formed a coalition with a mix of nationalist centre-left and left-wing parties, including the centre-left PDS and the National Conservative VMRO BND. So again, you can see here that it's a sort of electoral coalition that exists in Bulgaria and a lot of other countries, this sort of socially conservative nationalist group, as well as the sort of traditionally left-wing parties, positioned against more sort of liberal, socially progressive parties and people in the cities. In terms of polling, PB entered polling on the 23rd of January 2026. Prior to this, the centre-right Citizens for European Development of Bulgaria, or GERB, was the largest party in parliament and in the governing coalition, as well as in the polls. However, since PP entered the race, its coalition has led every single poll since then. The party itself has 33%. GERB and SDS is coalition party jointly, they have 21%, and it goes from there. So if PP were to receive 33% of the votes, or something around that, it would likely win an outright majority in the parliament, as long as it performs well across the whole country, given the electoral system there. They have multi-member open list proportional system with 31 constituencies, each with varying district magnitude. In 2024, for context, GERB won an outright majority with just 25% of the vote. So definitely a big shift in Bulgarian politics. A new movement or party has emerged. Let's see how long the next parliament will last and what the turnout will be as well, because obviously a predictable outcome of sort of such an amount of elections and all these scandals is a lot of Bulgarians simply not being engaged politically or going to the polls. So that will be another thing to watch out for.
Yeah, let's see. Quite interesting. I'm a bit concerned, to be honest, because it's this emergence of this new party who also has this somewhat ambiguous pro-Russian tendencies, and it a bit smells like a potential democratic backsliding in the future. Let's see how it goes. Okay, then let's switch to the next issue that we have. We had recently the federal land of Baden-Württemberg in Germany had the state election. In one of Germany's most economically important states, the election was closely watched as a signal of national political momentum. The Greens came first in Baden-Württemberg with 30% of the vote and 56 seats, beating expectations after polling third 6 months ago. Nationally, they sit around 12%, so this was a relative overperformance locally. They tied with CDU, which has gained 14 seats, but still disappointed as a frontrunner, seen as a blow to Chancellor Friedrich Merz. A minor scandal also hit CDU's lead candidate during the campaign. The Greens are set to retain the premiership, with Cem Özdemir expecting to succeed Winfried Kretschmann, becoming Germany's first Turkish-German state premier. A centrist pro-business figure, his popularity helped drive the Green surge. The AfD came third with 19% and strong gains. Meanwhile, traditional parties struggled. SPD fell to 5.5%, FDP lost all seats, and Die Linke again missed the threshold.
That was an interesting election, and the fact that the Greens sort of rebounded. It shows again that candidates and campaigns can sometimes matter. Now to a by-election in the UK that's got a lot of attention in Gorton and Denton. So there was a surprise result in a traditionally safe Labour seat that sent shockwaves through UK politics. This is because the Greens won their first ever by-election in UK history, with a candidate called Hannah Spencer securing over 40% of the vote, which is a 28-point increase on 2024, and the Greens' strongest by-election results ever. The Greens were followed by Reform UK on 29% and Labour on 25%. The big story, I guess, is the Labour Party's vote collapsing after having held that seat specifically since 1931. And Reform doubled their support and showed that they can be competitive, or sort of confirmed that their growth in the polls has happened, although it was sort of campaigned and the expectations were that it would be a much, much tighter race between the Greens and Reform than it turned out to be. Sort of forgotten in all of this because of the spectacular results of the other parties is that the Conservatives, who were recently in government for a decade plus in the UK, fell below 2% in the election, which is their worst ever by-election result. So a pretty seismic sort of result that's still sort of impacting the way parties are positioning themselves in the UK. The results reflect interesting local demographics in this specific seat, which is sort of, if you look at it, it's almost like it looks like an 8. So it's very clearly divided between two different communities, with one, Gorton, being sort of younger than average and having a high percentage of Muslim inhabitants. They went for the Greens massively, whereas the other half of the constituency is more white working class voters, and they swung to Reform, but obviously the swing from Labour to Green was much larger in Gorton than the swing to Reform was in Denton, and that's why the Greens managed to get the victory. Also, it's a very highly polarised campaign, with both the Greens and Labour claiming to be the main anti-reform option in the constituency. Obviously, there's been lots of national scandals in the UK tied to Keir Starmer's leadership, so that definitely had a massive impact on Labour's polling. Also, a lot of drama around the Labour candidate, where the very popular mayor of Greater Manchester, in which this seat is, Andy Burnham, trying to get selected for this seat to get into Parliament, but the Central Labour Party blocked him. Essentially, that's seen as a way to stop him getting into Parliament as an MP, and through that being able to challenge Keir Starmer's leadership. It was seen as a personal political move by Keir Starmer's candidate to stop a popular local politician getting in, and because of that, sort of enthusiasm for Labour in the campaign was badly hurt. As you can imagine, this result is a major shock to the two-party system of the UK that's existed for many, many decades, with the two sort of challenger parties of the last few years, the Greens to the left and Reform to the right, coming first and second. It really puts a lot of pressure on Labour and the Tories, and it sort of, everyone's sort of figuring out the dynamics going into the next general election, which is quite far away, but still, it's quite fascinating. And yeah, it'll be interesting to see. It's sort of mirroring a bit what's happened in France, I think, previously. We can discuss in our next episode. There are also local elections there happening now in March. This sort of splintering to the left and right, with the sort of radical factions of both becoming more politically successful than the sort of old mainstream parties that have just failed in their governing.
I think the second round is actually today of the Paris and other French mayoral elections, yeah. So we're going to keep an eye on it and probably talk about it in more detail in the next episode. And the last development that we'd like to share with you is coming from the Nordic nation of Iceland, which is heading toward a major decision on its future relationship with Europe, with a referendum now scheduled for 2026, I think either August or September. Iceland is already in a single market via the European Economic Area, but remains outside the European Union, keeping its own currency and control over key sectors like fisheries. Since applying in 2009, accession talks have repeatedly stalled over sovereignty concerns, especially when anti-EU parties have been in power. Additionally, fisheries were a common policy of contention between the EU and Iceland. A new coalition government has now committed to a referendum on August 29, 2026, asking whether to continue EU membership negotiations. External pressures, including the US trade tensions and comments on Greenland and including even Iceland, have accelerated the timeline. Public opinion is mixed. 58% support holding a referendum and 52% would currently vote to continue talks. However, a strong opposition remains, particularly from parties firmly against the EU integration. Even if voters back negotiations, the second referendum would likely be required before full EU membership.
As someone living in the UK, the phrase second referendum is giving me flashbacks. But to a different era entirely. But that is very interesting, obviously. It'll be fascinating to see how it goes and if there'll be like an actual membership referendum at some point. Obviously, we've seen NATO grow predictably as a result of the geopolitical shifts, but if the EU can also grow, that would be very interesting. And I think that wraps us up for today, Javid, unless there's anything else on your mind.
Nope.
No, and we wish all of our listeners, assuming most of you are election nerds like us, we wish you all the best with following all these election campaigns, results, analysis, and we will be back to discuss a lot of it in April. So thank you very much.
And enjoy the beginning of the spring.
Yes, enjoy the sun as much as you can.
Yeah.
Now that it's here.
Bye.
Bye. Thank you for listening to the EuropeLex podcast, which is hosted by me, Gabriel Hedengren, and Javid Ibad. Our producer and audio engineers were Leonardo Basso and Joao Reis. The script was written by our hosts and our writing team, Eric Balonwu, Thomas Stokes, and Ritwik Narendra. The music has been made by Jose Alvarado, and everything we do wouldn't be possible without our patrons on Patreon. To stay up to date with European politics, make sure you subscribe, and of course follow us on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube. You can find us at europelex.eu and at europelex across all social media. On Instagram, it's at Europe_Lex. See you next time, and thank you again for listening.